Hi everyone, and welcome to week 4. In this video lecture, I'm going to review some of the key developments in historiography, or the history of writing history, as well as some major related issues in epistemology, or the philosophical study of knowledge. Let's start by outlining some of the major theories of historiography over the last couple of centuries, going back to when the discipline of history became professionalized as part of the modern university system in the 19th century. The organization of the university system into the discipline-based departments that we're all familiar with was a reflection of the division of labor management style of the Industrial Revolution. Part of our challenge in undertaking interdisciplinary work today is to break out of these isolated silos. A key figure in this traditional mold was the German historian Leopold von Ranke, who famously defined the purpose of history as showing what quote-unquote actually happened. This famous quote epitomizes the philosophy of objectivity, realism, and empiricism, which are concepts we'll discuss in greater detail later on in the presentation. But the basic idea was that the writing of history should not be tainted by subjective biases, and instead offer an objective reflection of primary sources. According to him, if it is not in the documents, then as far as historians are concerned, it doesn't exist. Historically provable facts are thus said to reside in primary sources, particularly official documents that were produced at the time either by the state or by state-level elites. In that sense, historical writing is traditionally concerned with narrating political history from above, as opposed to what we'll see shortly as the post-1970s advent of social history from below. Although historiography has clearly come a long way since Ranke, some of his core principles remain fundamental, especially the theory of historicism, the meaning of which is twofold. First, this is the notion that we should aim to perceive historical periods in their own terms, rather than any imposed by the historian. That is to say, historians should aim to understand the events, actions, and thoughts of people at their own historical moment. This leads to understanding people as they understood themselves, rather than through the imposition of present-day concepts and categories of analysis. Secondly, historicism is the belief that an adequate understanding of the nature of any phenomenon can only be gained through considering it in terms of its own historical development. The Rankean notion of reconstructing history as it actually happened informed the common-sense empiricism that very much defined the traditional approach to historiography in the 20th century. I'll explain the meaning of empiricism later, but for now the key idea is that the facts of history precede interpretation, and that they lie waiting to be discovered in the documentary record. According to this tradition, historical writing thus requires the objective and forensic research into primary sources, which are assumed to directly correspond with the historical reality they are said to represent. This approach rejects the relativist view of historical knowledge, which we'll talk about later with regards to postmodernism. Instead, this traditional approach assumes that the truth does not depend on one's perspective. Historians should thus aspire to discover the absolute truth, or the common-sense idea that there is only one truth, driven by solid, verifiable fact. Now, as we'll see, this is philosophically problematic, but we have nevertheless inherited certain rules or guidelines that still command our respect and adherence. In particular, this tradition shows how historical facts can be discovered through inferential rules of evidence. First, historical facts can be found through comparing pieces of primary evidence, or, less convincingly, the descriptions of other historians which constitute our secondary evidence. Second, factual evidence is invested with meaning as it is correlated and placed within a context, sometimes called the process of colligation, collation, configuration, or emplotment, which then leads the historian to generate the quote-unquote facts. Traditionally, this process of contextualization is undertaken by the historian as part of the process of interpretation, as they relate masses of apparently unconnected data with an eye to producing a meaning. Third, factual evidence must be open to verification through further study of evidence. That is also to say that another researcher should be able to follow up on the same evidence and demonstrate the same historical facts. Finally, historians are supposed to assemble these facts into a written interpretation that accurately reflects the facts inferred by evidence. Emblematic of this traditional approach is the British historian R.G. Collingwood, although we could also point to some of the doyens of Holocaust historiography, such as Raoul Hilberg, Christopher Browning, both of whom epitomize Reconstructionist history. The next big development in Western historiography was the advent of the so-called Annales school in France, beginning in the late 1920s through the 1980s. Named after the academic journal that supported it, this historiographical tradition sought to promote a new kind of history. It substituted a traditional narrative of events with a problem-oriented analytical history, one that was concerned with the whole range of human activities rather than just politics. To such ends, the Annales school drew from a variety of disciplines, including geography, sociology, economics, and psychology. One of the most prominent proponents of this approach was the French historian Fernand Braudel, who wrote his monumental study of the Mediterranean during World War II. This work was divided into 3 parts, each of which exemplified a different scale or level of analysis. To understand the significance of this model, it makes sense to discuss these 3 parts in reverse order. The 3rd part was a more traditional political and military history of Spanish King Philip II. This short-term history of events, Braudel famously said, were just surface-level disturbances, crests of foam atop the larger tides of history. To provide further context, the historian must peer beneath the surface. Thus, the 2nd part of his analysis looked at the larger social structures that constrain the micro-level of events. This meso-level of analysis concerns broader economic cycles and societal shifts that develop across multiple decades, even a few centuries. Finally, the 1st part plunges into the depths of Braudel's oceanographic metaphor. Beneath the political history at the surface, and the social structures just below, lies a much deeper level of historical geography that forms an extremely slow-moving, almost imperceptible temporality. In the Anglo-American world post-World War II, the impact of the Annales intersected with the so-called New Left historians who adopted and revised Marxist theory. The Marxist paradigm is built around a theory of historical materialism, the premise of which is that the material conditions of life determine the nature of human consciousness and society, rather than the other way around. That is to say, economic factors, rather than ideas, politics, or cultural production, give a decisive direction to human history. Furthermore, this theory posits that society passes through a number of stages in historical development, from the primitive communism of hunter-gatherers to the ancient mode of production marked by slavery, then an era of feudalism, followed by capitalism, and then socialism and ultimately communism. Although it is questionable whether Marx himself rigidly adhered to this teleology, this theory was ossified by a new generation of theorists at the turn of the century who were grounded in the conviction that this theory of historical materialism was deterministic and that a socialist revolution was inevitable. Yet the revelations of Stalin's crimes in 1956, along with the brutal suppression of the Hungarian uprising that same year, led to a backlash amongst a younger generation of the political left that was disenchanted with these authoritarian tendencies. Perhaps the most prominent historian of this movement was E.P. Thompson, whose seminal book, The Making of the English Working Class, tells the story of how, between the late 18th and early 19th century, English working people developed a class consciousness based on a common identity and shared interest. These people were not hapless victims of larger structural forces. Rather, they were active agents in their own social and cultural formation. In order to uncover these forgotten historical subjects, Thompson both employed new forms of evidence, as well as reimagined the way traditional forms of primary source material could be used. For example, he looked at things like tax lists, court records, and contracts, which could be imaginatively used as hidden transcripts of a subaltern class consciousness. This was the advent of social history, which was self-consciously directed towards recovering the history of those whom traditional history had ignored: the poor, the working class, women, homosexuals, minorities, the sick, etc., demonstrating that their roles in historical change had been profound, and uncovering the historical circumstances in which they had been able to take control of their lives. So, if traditional historiography was history from above, this was history from below. It's worth noting, by the way, that an important branch of social history emerged in West Germany during the 1980s, known as Alltagsgeschichte, or the history of everyday life. Holocaust historian Martin Brochat exemplified this trend, leading a massive research project that looked at everyday life in Bavaria during the Nazi era. Concurrent with the development of social history has been a growing concern with gender. As an intellectual movement, this dates back at least to the political dissent of the 1960s, which generated a desire for the recovery of women from history by creating her story as opposed to his story. Feminism needed to provide role models or heroines for the purposes of post-1968 politics. While providing a corrective by recovering women from historical marginalization, this movement required more than simply going back and inserting women into the history books. So by the 1980s, gender had emerged as a broader category of analysis that asked how society was organized around sexual difference and the resulting power inequalities. In turn, this led to important developments in feminist theory, such as intersectionality and standpoint theory, which we talked about last week and which we'll return to later when we consider the epistemological challenges of postmodernism. A prominent figure in this development is the American historian Joan Scott, whose 1986 article on gender as a category of analysis is seminal. This article builds on a historicization of gender, showing how gender has been produced, reproduced, and transformed as a historical phenomenon. It shows how gender is a constitutive element of social relationships, built on perceived differences between the sexes. These relationships are not just limited to the private, domestic sphere of the household, but affect all public, social, and political spheres as well. To the extent that gender is implicated in social structures, this article also shows that gender is a primary way of signifying power relations, especially as gender metaphors are used to construct and endorse a great variety of unequal social relations that have no logical connection to sexual difference. As an analytical mechanism, therefore, a gendered approach to history should make it possible, she argues, to lay bare social inequalities and to show that they are indeed contestable. By the 1980s, a similar argumentative thrust came from the new field of post-colonial studies, which is primarily concerned with the lasting impacts of European colonial rule, especially in the sense of enduring cultural and intellectual models of the world. There's a paramount concern with deconstructing Eurocentrism, or the dominant belief that quote-unquote European civilization, i.e. the West, has some unique historical advantage, some special quality of race or culture or environment or mind or spirit, something that gives this human community a permanent superiority over all others. Furthermore, this approach is critical of the Western developmental model that has since diffused across the entire planet. This is a deep-seated belief, going back to some of the major thinkers of the 19th century. For example, both Hegel and Marx believed that the colonized peoples of Africa and Asia had no history of their own, so to speak. Now, such opinions are admittedly no longer in vogue, but it's still widely taken for granted that the West is the center of the world, whereas the rest are cast aside on the peripheries. In contrast, the post-colonial approach to history represents the perspective of how the world looks from the global south, not from the north. Post-colonial theory is especially concerned with the subaltern subject position, referring to those who are at the bottom of any hierarchy of power. A branch of post-colonial theory known as subaltern studies has shown how the subaltern may often be insubordinate, resisting forms of power through various means, including more overt means, such as rebellions and uprisings, as well as more covert means, such as through subversion or solidarity. This approach, by the way, has yet to be really applied to Holocaust studies. This is something we can discuss further on the discussion forum. Anyways, there were other important intellectual developments that emerged during the last few decades of the 20th century. Here we see the so-called linguistic turn in historiography, which was inspired by early 20th century revolutionary developments in semiotics, or the study of signs or symbols. Prior to that, language was understood as a relatively neutral medium of communication, sufficiently transparent to convey a reasonably accurate sense of reality. This reflected the common sense idea that words bear necessary relationships to things. Yet after this revolution in semiotics, we now understand that language is simply a mental system with no necessary relationship to the quote-unquote world of reality, and that language is instead an inherently arbitrary system of signs whose meanings are set by social conventions. As a result of this new understanding, the critical implication is that any direct, unmediated apprehension of reality is impossible. We'll explore the philosophical underpinnings of this position later, particularly as it relates to postmodernism. But for now, it's worth noting that a key figure in this development was Hayden White, who argued that all history writing is basically a linguistic and poetic act. Histories are not transparent records of the way things really happened. Instead, writing history involves selecting evidence and filling in the gaps. To do this, historians employ linguistic conventions. The takeaway here is that the meaning of history comes from the ways that the stories of the past are told. Cultural history is another development that goes back to the 1970s, or thereabouts, one that is very much related to the aforementioned linguistic turn. Unlike traditional history, which attempts to objectively understand and explain history as it really was, cultural history explores subjective experience. It aims to get inside the minds of peoples and groups in order to see how history was like for them. As such, this branch of historiography studies the past from a symbolic point of view, looking at how reality is constructed through intersubjectivity, or the production of common knowledge and beliefs. In this sense, cultural history has been inspired by the methodological insights of symbolic and interpretive anthropology, which are subdisciplines under the larger branch of cultural anthropology. These sub-branches of anthropology focus on the symbolic rather than material aspects that are unique to specific cultures. All social behavior has a symbolic component, in the sense that participants constantly must behave in ways that others will understand. Meaning exists only by virtue of common agreement. Indeed, cultures are essentially defined as systems of meaning. In this view, historically transmitted patterns of meaning, embodied in symbols, are the means by which humans communicate, perpetuate, and develop their own knowledge about and attitudes toward life. Symbolic anthropologists have developed a method known as a thick description, in which they collect data reflecting the point of view of society members who are studied through ethnographic observation. We'll talk about this some more in week 7 and 8. In any case, this branch of historiography is well summarized by this book from British historian Peter Burke, who actually shows that the historiographical study of culture has a pretty long genealogy, dating back to the 19th century. There are a number of scholars in our discipline who also adopt this approach, including Dan Stone, Alan Confino, and others. So, in the midst of all of these changes, the nature of historical writing has evolved. The traditional approach to history, as defined by von Ranke, was pretty straightforward. Historians wrote narratives, whereby historical materials were chronologically sequenced and ordered into a coherent story. Historical narratives were mostly descriptive, in the sense of delineating or giving a precise, detailed account of something. In that sense, traditional historians were concerned with the rhetorical aspects of their presentation, and their commitment to stylistic elegance reflected contemporaneous developments in literature, such as the popular 19th century genre of literary realism, which attempted to accurately portray reality by avoiding artistic conventions. But as we saw with the Annales school, this traditional approach was criticized for only covering the surface level of history, thereby glossing over the deeper, more complex, long-term processes of history that defied any simple narrative structure. These new 20th century approaches were critical of the methodological individualism of traditional narratives, the latter of which tended to show how historical change resulted from individual actions rather than structural processes. At the same time, however, these new approaches to quote-unquote scientific history have been critiqued as being too reductive and deterministic, thereby discounting the role of historical agency. Since the linguistic turn and the advent of cultural history, there's been an attempt to combine both narrative and structure. Historians still aim to tell stories, but not simply in the descriptive sense, as it actually happened, but how history was perceived by its subjects. Following the thick descriptive approach of cultural anthropologists, the goal is to now look at particular events and actors not for their own sake, but to reveal larger forces and structures. Okay, so now that we've covered a few of the big historiographical approaches of our time, let's turn to some issues in epistemology. A good place to start is with C.P. Snow's famous Two Cultures essay. C.P. Snow was a mid-20th century chemist and novelist who bemoaned what he saw as a bifurcation in Western philosophy, where, since the modern era, there's been a messy divorce between science and the humanities. It was those defending empirical science who insisted upon this divorce. They said that the only route to truth was theorizing based on induction from empirical observation, and that these observations had to be done in such a way that others could subsequently replicate and thereby verify the observations. They insisted that metaphysical deduction was speculation and had no truth value. They thus refused to think of themselves as philosophers. This divorce was institutionalized into the structure of the modern university system, with faculties broken up into schools and departments that distinguished the so-called arts from the sciences. The only legacy we have today of their erstwhile unity is that all the arts and sciences in the university offer as their highest degree the PhD, Doctor of Philosophy. But what about the children of this messy divorce? Namely, those disciplines that study social reality. Initially, what one saw is that the social sciences tended to place themselves in the middle between the pure sciences and the humanities. In the middle, but not comfortably in the middle. For the social sciences did not evolve a separate third way of knowing. Rather, they divided themselves between those who leaned toward a scientific view and those who leaned toward a humanistic view. On the one hand, economics, political science, and sociology veered towards the scientific end of the spectrum, aiming for what we call nomothetic observations of social reality that could be theorized as regular, universal, almost law-like features. On the other hand, anthropology and history was much more ideographic, pointed towards the particular, unique, and context-specific features of social reality. We'll discuss the nomothetic ideographic distinction next semester in my underpinnings class. With that said, we've already seen that the history of history as a modern professional discipline is a bit more complex. When the discipline was institutionalized by the late 19th century, it aspired towards the more scientific approach to the study of the past, one that was rooted in the principle of objectivism, with the scholar purged of any subjective bias, free from all personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing the facts. This assumes that there is, or should be, an absolute correspondence between historical reality and historians' facts. In other words, according to this common sense assumption, which is what philosophers refer to as the correspondence theory, the past is synonymous with history, and vice versa. The role of the historian is, or should be, it is presumed, to discover these historical facts, and, in this oft-repeated phrase, to represent history the way it really was. Accordingly, there is but one quote-unquote truth, which is capitalized here as a proper noun in order to emphasize the proposition that the truth is not constantly in flux and relative, but stable and absolute. This once dominant assumption was rooted in a positivist epistemology. As noted, epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge, i.e., how we know what we know, and positivism is an approach to knowledge that extends the scientific method from the natural sciences, disciplines like physics and biology, to the study of humanity. Again, as we've seen, this approach was further rooted in empiricism, or the theory that knowledge comes from sensory experience. In particular, empiricism assumes that what we as historians can know about the past is what it tells us through the available evidence and sources. Not just any sources, mind you, but, at least according to this traditional approach to historiography, official documentary sources that can only be found in archives, sources that are assumed to be neutral containers of capital T truth. Let's further probe the philosophical foundations of quote-unquote proper objective history, which is underpinned by a body of philosophy known as analytical philosophy, a core principle of which is a commitment to realism, or the common sense notion that material objects exist independently from our conceptual schemes. This aligns with the aforementioned correspondence theory, insofar as it assumes that the world exists independently from the words we use to describe it. This principle assumes that real-world facts are, quote-unquote, out there, waiting to be discovered, ideally in pristine form, like paleontologists uncovering ancient fossils in order to reconstruct a visualization of extinct life forms. In this analogy, the fossils are like legitimate primary source materials, or at least those documents that quote-unquote objective historians deem to be legitimate, which are further assumed to be accurate empirical reflections of the past. Now, many of these premises are critically challenged by another body of philosophy known as continental philosophy. As far as we're concerned, one key principle of continental philosophy is perspectivism, or the view that any claim to knowledge is bound to the perspective formed by the contingent interest or identity of the knower. This is roughly synonymous to feminist standpoint theory, which begins with the premise that all knowledge is socially situated. We can go one step further and assert that none of our knowledge is absolutely certain or universal. Concepts cannot directly represent objects in the world because our experience of those objects must in part be constructed using prior theories. Thus, concepts do not have a one-to-one correspondence with objects in the world. In other words, our conceptions of reality do not exist independently from discourse. There's no intrinsic connection between language and the things to which they refer. Language is essentially arbitrary and highly symbolic. Any referentiality we assume in language is the result of it being fixed by social convention. Our ability to represent the past through history is invariably filtered through language, and is therefore always ideologically loaded to reflect preconceived norms and standards. This means that we, as historians, are never able to look into the past unmediated, and that primary sources are not objective vessels of the capital T truth. Many of these critical insights have, since the late 1960s, been lumped together under the vague rubric of postmodernism, which is a bundle of philosophical ideas that inherently defies any singular definition. At best, we can define postmodernism as a critical reaction to the modernist ideas of the late 19th and 20th century. Accordingly, this philosophical movement is marked by an incredulity towards grand meta-narratives, or the master narratives of progress that underpinned ideologies like Marxism, liberalism, the Enlightenment, science, etc. The fact that we can no longer depend on such grand stories as universal benchmarks against which we can measure or ensure truth is what supposedly characterizes our postmodern condition. There are no foundational truths, no epistemological givens. This move towards anti-foundationalism is underpinned by the principle of epistemological relativism, based on the premise that our knowledge of the real world has to be assisted by our mental constructs. It follows that our situation in the world, and therefore our conceptualizations and representations of it, are affected by many forces beyond our control. How old we are, our race, the class we think we belong to, our gender, our ideological preferences, and the historical time and place in which we live. Again, this is essentially the same idea as perspectivism, or feminist standpoint theory. Now, this doesn't mean that anything goes, however. Contrary to a popular caricature, postmodernists do not claim that we can never know anything. They just emphasize that knowledge is produced and is provisional, never completely fixed, open to change. This is the basic idea behind constructivism, that our representations of reality are socially constructed, and that we cannot take reality as a given. The key insight of postmodern historiography, moreover, is that history is a literary artifact. It's an artifact insofar as it is something that is produced by humans, rather than occurring naturally. And it is literary in the broad sense that it's essentially language-based. Thus, in contrast to correspondence theory, which assumes that the goal of objective historiography is to simply discover the facts and tell it the way it really was, the key lesson of postmodernism is that we invariably face an insurmountable distance between the past, i.e. reality, or the past as it really was, and history, i.e. discourse about the past. Obviously, the past is never present. It's something we can never have. We cannot relive, retrieve, or rerun it as we might some laboratory experiment or computer simulation. We can only represent the past, represent, re-present, to present again, not literally, but figuratively. History can no longer be viewed as simply the discovery of the past. Rather, the genuine nature of history can be understood only as the creation and eventual imposition by historians of a particular narrative form on the past. This is the argument of American historian Hayden White, who contends that history cannot correspond to a given or pre-existing story of the past. There's no inherent meaning in the past, something out there waiting to be discovered in pristine form. The historical evidence we find in the archives, for example, are never just neutral containers of historical facts. Because all forms of evidence are necessarily transmitted via language, their meanings are never self-evident and are always open to varying interpretations. Accordingly, the historian provides meaning to the past, not through the empiricist's logic of discovery, but rather the logic of narrative making. Historical explanation involves assembling historical facts and events in some sort of order, essentially telling a story. This means that history writing requires the emplotment of the past. Emplotment is the act of giving meaning to the past through the construction of historical narratives. This point is as much practical as it is theoretical, but before I get to that, a word of caution. As I already noted, none of this means that anything goes. Although postmodernism problematizes all truth claims, it doesn't deny the truth altogether. Evidence does exist, and the facts built on it are constructed as individual referential statements of justified beliefs. Clearly, events did or did not happen, and single descriptive statements may be regarded as accurate or inaccurate in varying degrees. But lest we forget, facts are themselves only ever events under description, and they only become meaningful when we emplot them as part of our constructed narratives. Okay, so how do these philosophical insights work in practice? Our required reading this week by John Lewis Gaddis shows us how historians employ abstractions in order to overcome the insurmountable gap between the past and present. Abstraction in this sense means to conceptually withdraw or remove from reality in order to provide a more coherent representation from the outside or beyond. We can never provide a literal representation of past realities. Even if we could, it would be incomprehensible. For example, think about how subway maps are necessary abstractions of reality. Here on the left, you see a more useful abstraction of Berlin's subway system compared to its actual geography on the right. Obviously, a subway rider doesn't need to know all of the twists and turns or the exact distances between stops. They don't need a literal representation. They just need to know where to get on and off. Similarly, through the use of emplotment, or narrative making, historians provide a degree of abstraction in order to gain some semblance of understanding the past. There are three principal ways of doing this. First is the principle of selectivity. Think about how a filmmaker or storyteller has to make decisions about what to put in the foreground versus the background versus the much larger reality that's necessarily left out of the frame altogether. Second is the principle of simultaneity, of putting up different scenes of different times and places in some particular order. Again, think of how filmmakers or storytellers are able to jump around by juxtaposing scenes side by side. Third is the principle of scale, and here's where the camera metaphor is especially apt, as we can zoom in all the way down to the micro level of individual actors, and we can zoom out in order to capture large landscape shots. So these are some of the core principles of historical emplotment as means to an end, but to what end? What is our goal in writing histories? For one thing, we're trying to explain how or why things happened the way they did. In a word, we're trying to explain causation. But we should reject what Gaddis calls the doctrine of immaculate causation. There's never any single cause for any given effect. On the contrary, for any particular outcome, there's an infinite chain of necessary antecedents. For example, Gaddis imagines tracing the causes of Pearl Harbor all the way back millions of years ago, when the Pacific Islands first rose from the sea. Obviously, we don't need to go back that far, hence his principle of diminishing relevance. By rejecting the doctrine of immaculate causation, or the sense of inevitability between cause and effect, historians instead show how outcomes are contingent upon particular circumstances. Historical events depend on multiple causes and a variety of factors that are complexly interdependent. The one way to explain contingent causality is by sufficiently describing the historical context in which outcomes are produced. That is to say, by establishing the conditions and circumstances in which historical events occurred. Quite simply, providing context is sine qua non for historians. It is absolutely essential to the practice. I can't overemphasize this point enough. Whenever you write, be sure to provide context, context, context. Now, this is all well and good for quote-unquote regular or normal histories, say like a history of the French Revolution or the 19th century labor movement. But what about the Holocaust and genocide? How is it possible to represent, to re-present, to present again a quote-unquote limit event like the Holocaust? A limit event is something that is of such magnitude that it exceeds or strains our linguistic capacities because it transgressed or ruptured the stable categories we use to make sense of the world. For example, Theodor Adorno is often misquoted as saying that it was impossible to write poetry after Auschwitz. Now, he didn't exactly say that. On the contrary, the pathos of some artistic representations are perhaps better able to capture some essence of the truth. But this common misunderstanding of Adorno has nevertheless become lore, probably because it expresses an intuitive sense that, in the words of Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust is unique, not just another event. It was the ultimate event, he said, the ultimate mystery, never to be comprehended or transmitted. The Holocaust transcends history, he added. Only those who were there know what it was. The others will never know. Now, to a certain extent, this is true for all history. Of course, it's certainly taken to the extremes with the Holocaust, but we'll never truly know what it was like during the French Revolution, for example, or the 19th century labor movement. It begs the question, can the Holocaust, and genocides more generally, be dealt with like other parts of history? Even if it can, should it? Now, I don't know about this latter question, which is more an issue of normative ethics, but I believe Dan Stone affirmatively answers the former. His reading this week implores us to think deeply about the theoretical nature of history so that we may be more transparent thinking about the methods that we use to practically make sense of the past. Yet Stone tells us that, despite the many new approaches to history that we've covered thus far, Holocaust historiography tends to be quite traditional and methodologically unadventurous, sticking with a strict and narrow empiricism that aspires towards Leopold von Ranke's goal of telling history the way it really was. Of course, the stakes of Holocaust history are high, not least because of the pernicious threat of denialism. But at the same time, Stone laments that the massive attention to factual detail may come at the expense of interpretation and representation. For all of the massive amounts of historical work on the Holocaust, there's still a ton of untapped resources out there. So as he says, accessibility to source material isn't the issue. It's what to do with it once we get a hold of it. Hopefully, over the coming weeks, we'll get a better idea of some of the interpretive tools out there that we can possibly use to make sense of this all. But for now, that's pretty much it. This week is the third and final part of the source analysis project. Stick with the same dissertation that you worked with last week. There are 3 things I want you to focus on for this final part of the assignment. First, describe the dissertation's methodological approach. The author should be explicitly stating this. If they don't, try to infer it to the best of your abilities. Second, what sort of evidence is being used to support the argument, and how are they using it? This requires diving into the body chapters a bit more. Finally, what sort of theories are used to help analyze the evidence? The authors may be explicitly stating this in the intro, but look at the references in the footnotes or endnotes in the body chapters. Also, just another reminder about your research proposal project. I want to emphasize that this is just a proposal. You don't actually have to complete a research project. You're just coming up with a game plan, but you don't have to execute it. The purpose of this assignment is to get you all familiar with the formal elements that go into a dissertation proposal. So this exercise is primarily about form, not content. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.